Hello and welcome at episode 482 of the Design for Impact podcast. Today you are listening to the conversation with Zulfia Abawe. Zulfia is a lecturer in global business and cohort lead in the MBA Global Program at the Faculty of Business and Creative Industries at the University of South Wales, holding 3 postgraduate degrees, including a master's in public policy, LLM in human rights, and a PhD in law and democracy. She has extensive experience in political and legal analysis, with a particular focus on Afghanistan's legal pluralism and political institutions. Her PhD dissertation examined Afghanistan's legal pluralism from a gendered perspective and its reflection, or lack of, in the 2004 Afghan constitution. Currently, she's exploring relationality and decoloniality as an analytical and theoretical framework to study foreign interventions in Afghanistan from 2001 to 2021, emphasizing decoloniality, local practices, and decolonial knowledge production in legal and political developments. My name is ErnoHannink, and I share my knowledge, experience, and expertise with you. I coach entrepreneurs so they can make decisions that will help them to grow their impact. This was a very interesting conversation. I learned so much, so many things I want to learn about decolonization, about work that's going on, and a great source for me in this conversation was Zulfia. So let's get started. Welcome in a new podcast episode. Today I'm talking to Zulfia Abawe. Welcome, Zulfia.
Thank you.
I'm trying my best to pronounce your name right, but I also understand now I'm pronouncing the country where you come from wrong. So how do you pronounce Afghanistan? How do you pronounce it?
I call it Afghanistan.
Afghanistan.
Yeah, because with we have a little bit of kind of the truth use. It's the language itself. So Afghans call it Afghanistan. So that's why. Otherwise, in the West they call it Afghanistan.
The Dutch also have this G in the back
Yeah,
of it, so we
yeah.
should be able to do that right. If we know how to pronounce it, we should be able to do it right. I have got in contact with you after a session with Rukmini Iyer, who had like 3 sessions on decolonizing the inner development goals. And if you want to learn more about that, you have to. I have an episode with Rukmini in the podcast. I will link to her in the show notes. You can listen to that. It's a very interesting podcast. But we, after that, had a very interesting conversation too about colonization and decolonization. Let's start with where you work, because I think you have a not so typical background from my regular guests. So where do you work? What do you do?
So I'm a lecturer at the University of South Wales. It's very interesting because my research focus and my teaching focus are kind of it's distinct. So I lecture in organizational behavior, human resource management, and leadership, and I will be focuses more on multinational businesses. But then I've been offered another module which I'm going to teach next semester, and that's more public services and organizations in the public service. And I'm also cohort lead, which means that I'm leading a group of like a cohort of students who come from different parts of the world, ensuring that their journey as students are very smooth. So kind of I'm the front person to help them when they come over to the UK. And we are working with a lot of international students from Southeast Asia. That's my teaching side of work, and then the research is more focused on international relations, decoloniality, relationality, looking into foreign interventions in Afghanistan and how it can be seen and analyzed from a different perspective, mostly driven from decolonial approaches. And I don't know if I just want to kind of give a caveat here because the word decoloniality carries a lot of sensitivities, especially when I interact with people from different backgrounds. And some people might think that it kind of implies a binary of like global north and global south or east and west. And that's something which I'm not working on. It's more of extension of the way we look into reality, extension of the way we understand things, and allowing different types of epistemologies to come to the surface. So it's absolutely not creating a binary, it's more extension of what we already know and the frameworks we have and challenging some of them.
I think there's an interesting point here, and it related to a post you wrote about your visit to a summit you were, and about your accent. I think it has a lot to do with where you have been living for longer periods of your life. You've been living in Germany, of course, in Afghanistan, but also in Germany, in the US, in the UK, in Wales. So there's a lot of mixture of cultures that you have been part of and interacting with and picking up their accents as well, of course, in the way that you talk right now. And I think that's very connected to me. It sounds very connected to looking at colonization as, what are the words that we're using? How are we looking at this? Because if you look at from just north and south or east and west, that's just a very Western kind of view in general. That's how we in the Western world look at these issues. But I can imagine if you live, for example, in Africa, you look completely different. Or if you live in Afghanistan, you look completely different at this topic. So it has a lot to do with the culture where you come from, where you've grown up, what you bring with you in your history, and how you think about these topics. And you have such a wide variety of this that I can imagine that you have a very different perspective on how you could look at this.
Thank you so much for bringing that up because I agree with you. So I have lived in Pakistan, Afghanistan, and I lived in Germany. I came to the UK. I went to the US to do a PhD, educated in five different education systems. I'm a multilingual, and as much as I don't want to put my research on a shelf. So every day research I do, it kind of I reflect how it's changing things for me, how I see my everyday kind of experiences. It changes the whole thing for me. And I also kind of see it more of a change in character and the mindset and perspective. And the more I lived in different societies, and I remember first time when I went to Germany, I was way too conservative. I was very shy. I wasn't open to engaging with even talking to people from different cultures. But then I know with the experience it kind of changed. And it didn't just change based on my kind of lived experience and how I interact with people now. It also changed in terms of my more professional research and the way I look at that every time because there are some scholarships which do create that binary. And I take a moment, I reflect like I don't want that. As much as I like this theory, how am I going to make that more emancipatory and kind of inclusive? And thank you for telling me about the accent. It was really interesting because when it was a conference. It was by Raulenberg in Istanbul, but it's a Swedish organization. They're doing a lot of work on human rights, and they had a conference on Afghanistan. So I interacted with so many people. Afghans were there, and I had colleagues, obviously, and participants from the US, New Zealand, and it was really interesting because everybody I was speaking with, some people were picking up Welsh with my accent, and then obviously because I live in Wales, some things which I never thought about, and then it did make me reflect. I was like, is it because I'm picking up some bits and pieces of accent from different places? Like I was in Scotland here, and is that changing the way I speak? And everybody kind of hear that. And from different like Afghans, they were like, "Oh, you speak pure British." And if you say that to somebody Britain here, and then they'll be like, "Absolutely not." And then I've had people who told me, "Oh, you speak Irish." My manager is Irish, and I kind of go back to him, and I'm like, "Is it because I've picked this up from you, and you're now having influence over my accent?" That accent is just kind of a symbolic element. It made me think deeper because a lot of things goes into our subconscious. We never kind of go back to that space to unpack and see why do I think this way or what is informing or influencing this. So accent was that moment when I kind of made me think. And when I wrote about my experience, which got a lot of views, and I had people contacting me about the blogs and stuff, which was really interesting, and they picked up the same thing. And also, it kind of connects with the human curiosity in a way, like how much we are interested in kind of small things, or it could be a small for me, like accent, but then it has a kind of baggage behind it, a history behind it, and makes you think like, okay.
So I was wondering because like I mentioned in our pre-conversation, is that I've done a little bit, really tiny bit of research on Afghanistan. There's also a history with the Brits.
Mm.
Was that also, did you feel some negative emotions from the people from Afghanistan with you having a British accent?
No, absolutely not. I think it depends. So when it comes to the history of Afghanistan and the nation building and the state building in Afghanistan, I'm not somebody who knows way. I wouldn't call myself a historian on Afghanistan, but the bits and pieces I've learned about Afghanistan and its history, obviously there was influence of Britain, especially in the beginning of 19th century. And there's that kind of, that's the history. And Afghanistan is called the graveyard of empires because before even the idea of the project of nation state building started across the world. There were a lot of empires which ended up in Afghanistan, and obviously they didn't. So, as some Afghans, again, how you construct the narrative and who is talking about Afghanistan is going to give you a new kind of narrative, a different type of narrative. But something which I have found overwhelmingly amongst Afghans, which I have interacted with, or even when I look at some social media posts, they're kind of proud, like, oh, this is the graveyard of empires. No power can stay in Afghanistan for long, and they always fight them. So that is one bit. But when it comes to the accent and the everyday life and social things, it's kind of it's going to be a bit of a controversy I might create here once, and I read this something somewhere, it says once something becomes a brand, a lot of people wants to connect with that and kind of relate to that because it's a form of like an achievement. When it comes to kind of accents and the way you speak English, it also is connected with your education. And there was a time in Afghanistan, and even now, like kind of getting education in the West is a kind of a massive accomplishment, and the way you speak, and if it's fluent, that in itself is an accomplishment in itself. And when I encountered Afghans in the conference, they were happy for me, and they were like, okay, like, so she thinks differently, and the way she thinks, and she's able to articulate things and communicate because English is not my first language. And I've had a couple of them speaking to me, and they said, how did you do this? Because it's so articulate, the way you speak, how did this happen? And that level of curiosity. And obviously, my answer was perhaps maybe because I'm teaching and it's the lecturing and the experiences I have. But there was a welcoming tone from a
Hmm.
lot of people I spoke with. Not just because of my accent, but the way I'm translating my thoughts into a simple everyday language. Even the questions I raised, it was challenging the status quo in a lot of ways because another aspect of my research is the kind of this savior victim framework where a lot of the work done on Afghanistan was kind of the Western approaches or the savior for the victims, especially women in Afghanistan. So that's where I wanted to challenge that idea was like temporarily it's about time, somebody might feel like a victim, but it's never going to stay, it's not permanent, and how we are going to unpack that idea. And not every Afghan woman is a victim. Everybody has got their agency, regardless, they're going to come up and use their agency in a strategic way. Even if you choose to be silent, that in itself is agency. And for a long time, when I was studying scholarships, speaking to people, they were like, oh, just because they're silent. And I'm like, what if they choose to be silent? And then I looked into a lot of other kind of mechanisms and tools like poetry in a very private, intimate space. And women, they see it like from Pashtun community, they see it as a form of agency. They're expressing their emotions. So all of these kind of information I got here and there, I was like, okay, this savior victim narrative, it needs to be challenged.
I think this could be related. Let's see. Why did you leave Afghanistan?
Okay, so I left Afghanistan first time. I went to Germany to do a master's degree. Finished my master's, and then obviously I was. This is really interesting because when I did my master's in Germany, Germany's education system is quite. It requires students to be proactive. So by the time I finished my master's, I was like, okay, this is not enough because I didn't learn as much, and I wasn't even confident to call myself like I've got a master's degree. So there was that tense kind of feeling in me. I was like, I really want to do another degree. So I did another degree and I applied and I got fortunate to come to the UK. And even then, I wasn't satisfied. But then I went to Afghanistan as soon as I finished my master's. And when I went to Afghanistan, I got a job offer from the government, and that it didn't ended up to be very secure for myself and for my family. So I decided to come back to the UK, and then I went to the US to do a PhD. And I think a lot of the things somehow is so connected with the environment you grew up. As a child, when I grew up, I could see that women in Afghanistan, it's a patriarchal society regardless, and women needs to put in double the work most of the times to get somewhere. And for me, and also education. So my mother got married when she was really young. She was 16 years old, and somehow that experience made her make sure all her kids gets enough education, and we travel as much as we can. So I personally, I managed kind of to do that, and I always had that support. And my mother always kept reminding me that regardless, you have to make sure you get as much education as possible, and the books are your best friends. And she was like, yeah, just don't hang out with people, read more books. And one of the things which I've written in one of my blogs, like, where is that coming for my mom, she's not educated, she's not well traveled, and she's not somebody even who watches TV. So I was like, where is this knowledge coming from? So that is where kind of the idea of intuition comes in.
But does it feel like you're under pressure to make something of your life?
I mean, the way it sounds, it should be, but no. Because when I kind of combined with my upbringing and the environment I was in, it somehow made me feel motivated, challenged, and excited at the same time. I always thought I'm going to change things, regardless, even if it's a very small thing, but that change needs to start from myself. And how every time I was telling myself that you have to be powerful, and the only way you can is to get more education and more knowledge of different places. And I ended up being, I don't know if I can call them lucky, or some people say that whatever you manifest, it comes your way, or the energy you put out there. So for some reasons, it all transpired to work in my favor. It wasn't easy, let me tell you. It's not easy. Every time I found myself in a new country, in a new society, and starting from zero, it has been extremely challenging. But this motivation of getting education and being an agent of change at some point kept me going. And now, even now, when I teach, it is really interesting. I had a student yesterday, and it kind of goes back to what you just said about the question of all of these things connected, our upbringing, environments we lived in. The way we think is changed completely. So I had a conversation. I was teaching, and this was about ethical leadership. And then I was like, whenever we're discussing ethical leadership, we have to make sure we are looking into every dimension. It's not just about the morality of the leader, it's the institutes we are working with, the people we come across. And there was a case study, and I just wanted to throw that out to the students to ensure everybody thinks and what dimension is missing. At the end of the conversation, this woman came to me, only like we have worked like for 3 weeks now, like less than 3 weeks. And she was like, last week I was trying to make my mind, but this week I'm so confident, I'm so inspired by you, and I really want to be like you. And I was like, oh my God, that is such a beautiful moment. Somebody coming and like telling you that thing because of just because the way you think and it's inclusive and people pick up on that. And again, it also comes down to simple communication because I've got an international students and I try to make it as simple as possible, especially when it comes to these ideas of philosophy, deep thinking, and all of that. So somehow just for them to connect. And I think it also goes back to, I keep reminding them, don't shy away from your experiences. Bring it in, especially in the day of AI. Everything might sound robotic unless you bring in your experience and lived experience. And I think that in itself also is something which has been reinforced in decolonial theory. It's about them. It's about their lived experiences. And I really want them to be seen and feel seen. So I think, yeah, these are the experiences.
I think it's a very interesting direction. And what I also feel, I'm very curious to hear your experience on this, is we see in a lot of European countries and in the UK that the far right or extremists or ultra right, however you want to call this, are getting more power and seats and space in general in in the media or in the politics. And obviously with all that power also in the streets, right? We see a lot of fights going on which have no real background except for like I need to get to a right. How do you experience that as do you feel like a foreigner right now, or do you feel like I'm part of this culture?
I think that's okay, that's a very good question, regardless of what's happening with the politics here in the UK. It's something which I've sat down with myself and I've reflected on and I continue reflecting on. As much as I think that I'm not part of this entity, the more I can get away from everything, and I might be kind of feeling isolated eventually. That is one way of looking at it. Another way of looking at it is like, regardless of what people think of me, whether they think I'm a foreigner, whether they think I'm part of this entity and I'm part of this culture. So I stopped investing as much energy and thinking on those. And then instead, I told myself, how about I invest my energy and focus my energy on something better, where I don't think as much about whether I am part of this culture or otherwise. Because the more I do, I don't know why I will attract similar kind of energy in people and I'll have similar encounters where people will be like, oh, this you're not part of this culture or something like that. And I was like, and I've had experiences where that happened. And I always wanted to rise above because having that goal in mind, because if I react in the same way, it's going to create more divisions. And I've told myself, it's fine. I'm going to rise above and I'm going to be the one who's going to bring in the light. It's fine. And if I don't see that coming from other people, so it might happen and it is happening. But the only thing which I have been trying is not to think so much about it. And within the kind of the institute where I work, yes, there are challenges, but then there's also that part of it where it's all international, it's very inclusive. I work with a very group, a kind of an inclusive group of people. But then I also had experience of working with local people. Entire team was local at the university, and I had a very good time with everybody. It comes down that I don't want to see myself as somebody who is not part of this because at the end of the day, we are all human. And I always bring that regardless, everybody's going through something. Even with the idea of like kind of race and everything, end of the day, it's all socially constructed. There was a time when I was working with people and I was like, okay, if I speak about race, which obviously it is something I'm not denying, but then somebody else is having a disability, which very minor, and they don't get something. And there are some other people with protected characteristics. And it made me think like, or some people just for being women, or some people for just being a certain type of individual. It kind of made me think like, okay, so if I only think myself and play the race card, which I'm not denying. It happens. People experience so many different things on the grounds of race. But then at the same time, now let's if we shift the spotlight on the other side, when you said about the right politics and everything, and I had a conversation with one of my friends the other day. I was like, okay, this is such a smart game they're playing. First of all, the economy is shrinking here. A lot of people are not happy. There's a lot of anger because of the economy to start with. And then they're playing the immigration card because people are angry and they just want to take it out on something. And then the level of knowledge and education, even again, social media, the information, as much as we hope that access to more information is going to make people smarter, apparently in a lot of cases it's working the opposite direction and that critical thinking is lacking. So there's those things and I wouldn't blame them. If I see it from an educational perspective, I've been in platforms and spaces where people do not want to get education and they are like, why would we? They don't have enough support, young people. So that is also a big massive problem in the UK. We don't get a lot of home students coming in and studying undergrad, grad, and that in itself is a problem. If it goes on within the next 10, 20 years, we are not going to be living in a very good society with people who are not critical thinkers.
I completely understand and agree what you're saying. I brought this point up because I think it has a lot of connections with what we're talking about. Because you talked about the victim role before,
Mm.
We talk about colonization and about the language that we use. We talk about all these things. I think it's all connected with what you just described, how you feel at this moment in this situation. And like you described, it has something to do with race, but there's all these other things that are also setting us apart or we could fight on, right? Right now, it's immigration, but we could talk about LGBTQ, or we could talk about women versus male. We could talk about, there's so many things we could talk about. There's always inequalities that we can talk about and discuss on how that, what's happening in this space or what's happening in this situation. There was another thing that was I found interesting, and I thought, okay, let's ask a question about that. Was so you had this event in Istanbul about Afghanistan. Why Istanbul about Afghanistan? So I think there's a lot of cultural things going on there.
So this is again a very interesting question. Thank you for bringing that up. The organization is Swedish, and as I said, they're human rights. But then they wanted to have it in Azerbaijan, the conference, because the intention behind was to have as many participants from different parts of the world with no problems with visas. So Azerbaijan proved to be very difficult, and they've changed it to Istanbul because Istanbul as a hub was easier for a lot of participants to come from across the world. And there are some scholars who have just left Afghanistan in 2021 when the Taliban took over, and a lot of them are having pending documents which allows them to travel to certain countries. So they don't have that freedom of movement. That's why they've picked up Istanbul, and this is the same thing with for other conferences. Most of the times, Istanbul is a kind of an accessible place for having participants. We were locked in one place, kind of two, three. No, it was a week long, heavy days. So in terms of culture and stuff, I don't know if the organizers thought that okay, we are going to bring in Afghans here and all other participants to also enjoy a bit of kind of culture in Turkey. I don't know if that was the intention. The main intention was to make sure people can come in and be there in person. And also, there's a lot of kind of movement in conferences where they want actual people to come in. The reason being, there's a lot of networking going on after these kind of panels, presentations, and they really want people to come in together and connect instead of having them online. So that was another reason. And that's why they were pushing for Istanbul. That was a question I asked one of the organizers. I was like, why did you move from Azerbaijan? I've never been to Azerbaijan for very selfish reasons. And then they said, oh, because we needed more people to come in. I was like, how about Azerbaijan next time?
So you do teach, and you teach people who are probably going to work like in a corporate environment. And with the new teaching that you're coming up is who work more like in nonprofits or like organizations or governmental organizations. But your studies are a lot about colonization and about Afghanistan, and it sounds kind of like separate, and probably isn't, but you just mentioned I don't want to leave my things on the shelf. So explain to me how this is connected for you.
I think this is something which I should, at some point in my life, I should write about this. As much as I see it, and also it comes across for people when I do work on research, and I'm in a very individual experience. Also, it can become a bit isolated. Like I'm working on a paper at the moment. It's about a nomadic community in Afghanistan, and I want to focus on their epistemic agency. They're non-sedentary. They move, and I want to see mobility as a form of knowledge in itself, and it challenges this idea of anthropocentrism, which focuses on humans at the apex of all creatures. They're the super kind of humans, and they can use anything for their own benefit. And obviously, that's where I'm challenging that, and I'm like human and non-human, including environment, land, water. Everything has got agency. So that hierarchy of human being on top and using everything for their benefit should be challenged. And that is kind of the research I'm focused on at the moment. But then comes teaching. Regardless, no matter what, we always have something, and I have something to bring into the teaching from my research. Corporate world can be, and especially like yesterday I was speaking about ethical leadership, corporate world can be very like rigid and logical in approaches and the way they see look into things. And most of the times it's about profit. But then obviously not every organization or corporate thinks like that. But for my students, I really want to highlight that when it comes to corporate, we have to also think about everything else. So I was looking into one of the books, which is a key textbook in my kind of one of the key textbooks for teaching. And this is by Northouse, and he's speaking about different forms of leadership. And I really want to teach critically. And I ask my students, how do you see things? So yesterday, a lot of the conversations in Northhouse's book and his podcasts and everything else is about the people and how they need to be ethical. So one of the definition is about people doing the right thing for the right reasons to achieve a common goal. And I put that definition of Northouse on the screen and I asked my students, what do you think about this definition? I had only one student, and he said, actually, this is focused a lot on people and their relationships. It's not talking about non-human and
Hmm.
our relationship with them. And that was the moment when actually I got very happy. I was like, at least somebody's thinking about this. Somebody's thinking beyond people and profit, which organizations, especially the corporate, want to make. And I really want to see them as future leaders who are not just thinking about people. And that is where my research comes in. And I told them, oh, I'm actually working on this, challenging anthropocentrism and how we are going to connect with non-human. And even I told them, as future leaders in businesses, one is social responsibility, corporate social responsibility. Another one is the environment. Obviously, you want to make sure you have products and services which doesn't harm the environment, but at the same time, look beyond that. How are you going to help the environment? Like there was a case study of Ben and Jerry's producing ice cream, but they're doing so many other initiatives on the side, which is helping like immigration, LGBTQ, refugee, asylum. So that type of thinking. And to be honest, a lot of these conversations happens because of the research I'm doing, even though I'm doing it in kind of very isolated ways, but it always comes and translates in one way or the other when I teach. So I think I like that. But then also, if I may say this, I think Focus said that we are a complex mixture of different identities, and it also depends on which space where I find myself. When, for example, I'm in a conference where people are discussing about Afghanistan, a lot of the conversation is about that. So that is one pocket of information, kind of vibrant. And then I find myself in another place where they're talking about kind of social mobility, UN Global Compact, and there's so much you can bring in. And then you kind of find yourself in a space of like teaching. So it's different spaces where you find yourself, and also the different identities that comes to the fore, and your different sides and how they kind of play out. Again, that in itself is a form of kind of decoloniality, in the sense that you allow that to happen and you reflect, and it's very fluid.
To me, it sounds a lot like being a philosopher, right? Acquiring wisdom.
Possibly, and also apart from acquiring wisdom, it's more about kind of questioning so much,
Yeah.
thinking deep.
But that is acquiring wisdom to me.
That's
Questioning and
true.
asking
Yes.
questions and asking other people so that you learn because you could of course get wisdom from books, but I think if you're having conversations with people different from yourself, different cultures, different backgrounds, that is where you'll learn most. That is what you really learn, where you really acquire not knowledge but wisdom.
Absolutely. I agree. I just, it kind of reminded me. So one day I was going to an appointment. I came across this book outside somebody's house. They had a kind of a pile of books just for people to collect it for free. When you said whether you've kind of pronounced my name correctly, so you did it so well, because a lot of people calls me Sophie here in my workplace. So the book is called Sophie's World.
All right.
And then this is about kind of philosophy,
Yes.
and the author is explaining that this is written by Justin Gardner, and he's explaining these complex philosophies from way before. Of course, it's very Western, to a 16-year-old. Her name is Sophie, and I know a friend of mine saw the book, and she was like, "You cannot be more selfish. You're reading something about your world." was like, no. And this comes back to your point about acquiring knowledge. A lot of the things that these philosophers have done was raising the questions. I think I would say perhaps the right questions. This now connects back to my conversation with my students. They use a lot of AI. And sometimes when they do the workshops and assessments, they come back and it doesn't answer the question perfectly or in a right direction. And I'm like, you are living in a golden age. You've got every kind of access to every tool and platform to do an excellent work. But where you're missing out is you're not asking the right questions. And I reinforce and I tell them when you read a question from the assessment, sit with the question for 10, 20 minutes and ask yourself, what am I asked to do here? So that art of questioning and reading the question, it's extremely important. And I so much agree with you. That in itself is a form of acquiring wisdom because asking the right questions is not easy. It needs a lot of thinking. So yeah. So I agree with what you just said.
Looking at your research that you've been doing and are still doing, a lot is about Afghanistan.
Mm-hmm.
And so your mom kind of like to me feels like also like a philosopher saying, okay, you have to go outside and acquire wisdom and acquire knowledge. And you answering to that question and doing it, and also becoming then a teacher, teaching other people wisdom and knowledge, which makes it, like a circle of life, right? Is it your research on Afghanistan, has that a lot to do with your past, your upbringing, your culture, or is there other things why it specifically is a very interesting topic for you to do the research on?
This is an excellent question. I have been still reflecting on this because when I started doing my PhD, I've been in a very kind of positivist area. What do I mean is like knowledge, sorry, law has been institutionalized in the US and the different jurisprudence that we were focusing on, it's a very logical way of looking into law and how it has been institutionalized in a lot of Western societies, especially America, the Constitution, everything else. It's a very logical way. And I opted for complete opposite. I was working on legal pluralism instead. I wasn't just looking into how a state is enforcing or creating laws. I was looking into how societies and communities are doing it. And to be honest, where did that come from? I don't know. And I'm still trying to kind of identify. And I was speaking with another colleague yesterday about my current research. And I was stuck and I was like, I don't know what made me or what exposed me to decoloniality and indigenous knowledge. I've got another paper which is under revision. It's about relationality. It's a completely different way of looking at things. What it advances is like instead of looking into static entities, it could be a very logical, rigid way of looking at things because you see the cause and effect. But relationality is the opposite. Relationality says, look into the process and don't decide for it. Wait until the process tells you, or the relationships, what is going to be the outcome or the byproduct or the product of that outcome. Instead of going into a room with our preconceived and determined knowledge, we go into a room with open mindedness and let that process, relationship, whatever it is, give rise to a new form of knowledge. So, how I came across all of these ideas and why, I don't know. I've just been trying to reflect on that and identify that moment in my life where I'll be like, oh, okay, this is the time when it actually happened. But somehow, vaguely, I can connect it with my lived experiences because of living in so many different societies. And my experience has been, again, as somebody, as an outsider, you go into a society with a lot of kind of assumptions and preconceived notions of everything and culture. And then you live, and then you're like, oh my God, there's so many similarities amongst people and cultures, more than you ever thought. So that becomes in itself very fluid. And I have done that over and over again every time I found myself in a different society, basically, and lived there for a few years. It's also kind of different from when people says, "Oh, I'm traveling a lot also," and it made me think like, what type of travel? Because it depends. Are you really kind of immersing yourself and giving yourself time to engage with people and learn from the locals, or is it just going there? being in a luxury hotel, not doing anything, just in the beach and you come back. I would call them different types of traveling.
Yeah, I think if you look at travel from the past, where people had to travel by carriage or by horse or walking, there was so much more space to really interact with culture. And there's so much, of course, this also was a privilege for some people. It wasn't for everybody. That's the same true today. Travel is
Mm,
also still a privileged thing. So, what I found interesting here is what you mentioned about looking at similarities, finding similarities, right? And I think it's very related to the topic of colonization. So if we it's a very broad topic, colonization. But if we look at the conversations we had about decolonizing the inner development goals, how do you see this topic to make it a bit smaller?
I think we had this conversation also. A lot of things has to start from within, and that's something I've been working on. And one of the things which I really kind of got, I haven't done a lot of the sessions on decolonizing and development, but one of the things which I came across this work from Paulo Freire, if I'm saying his name right, and that's where it says that you need to kind of decolonize your inner kind of look, stand in front of the mirror and ask yourself how many of the kind of colonized legacies you're carrying yourself. So it's not so much about questioning the institutions and the kind of the norms which is not working. It's also questioning yourself. So I think for me, decolonization is that process of reflecting and re-reflecting and questioning things that I need to change within myself in order for me to allow to see something differently or allow that leeway and freedom to actually connect with people. And it kind of goes back, even not just people and the non-human, I've came across a piece and I don't remember the name of the scholar. I just vaguely remember, and this was a few years back. I think she's from an indigenous Aboriginal community in Australia, and she was writing about a piece of work where she said how much she's listening to the environment and the land itself, even to the extent that it informed her journeys and whether she needed to take the trip to the US. She said, even reading the environment, the climate in itself tells you so much. So the message and brings me that idea of agency to hear from the environment itself. But again, you have to have that um, kind of perspective and that frame of reference within yourself, challenged and over challenged in some parts, to be able to see things like that, to be able to connect with people and the non-human and the environment, which goes beyond just the rational cause and effect. And I think I don't remember the exact quote, and I think it was Plato, and I read that on Sophie's World, where
Hmm.
it said initially, and this is when I say Western, it's mostly the modern post-Enlightenment 18th century, where the entire focus is on rationality, cause and effect. And I think it was Hume who said, anything which you can feel in your senses, it's knowledge, and you can rationalize it, it's knowledge. Anything beyond that, I don't count it as knowledge, it doesn't exist. But then there comes relationality where it talks about intuition. A lot of the things cannot put in words, but that is a form of knowledge. Our bodies carry knowledge. So going back to Plato, he said knowledge was produced by mind, soul, heart, and desire. And every knowledge which is being produced from these different parts is going to be different. But what we have done post enlightenment is a lot of the knowledge which is driven from mind. So I'm now in that phase in my life where I don't have the knowledge to actually understand other forms of kind of knowledge and explain them. Even I don't know whether I should be explaining them, whether that should be the goal. And that's where even the intuition comes in. And that's something which I have been focusing and thinking about. And I just want to give you one example. I was in an conference, it was a few months ago, at the university, a very intelligent young lady. She was working in computing and statistics. So she came and she was talking about data and how you put in data, all these beautiful charts, everything, analysis, statistics, put in your information here, and that's how it's going to inform decisions. And then I raised my hand and I was like, that is brilliant. Yes, we do need data. We do definitely. But how about intuition? Sometimes you have all the evidence right in front of you and something doesn't feel right. And that is where your intuition is trying to tell you something. And there has been so many instances in my life where I've actually had evidence. And then I'm like, okay, but my intuition is not going with this, and I have to listen to that. But you cannot put any words and logic into that part of intuition, which is trying to tell you something. But then how would you put that in today's post-enlightenment rational kind of knowledge? And the same thing is when now there's a bit of work being done on indigenous production of like medicines or things, which is completely different from a kind of rational type of production of knowledge. So there is those voids where I'm finding myself when it comes to inner development, how I can work with them to better understand it. And does it have to be something like explained or articulated, or it has to be different? How about we just feel things? It sounds perhaps like nonsense at the moment, but what if that is also a form of knowledge?
This is an interesting topic for me. I've been listening to and reading the books, for example, of Dan Ariely. He's an Israeli American professor, and also Daniel Kahneman. And I feel a lot for the way that Daniel Ariely is saying this about intuition. When you have lived experiences, I should say, and have a lot of experiences on a certain topic, and have seen the quick relationship between a decision or an action and the results. There's a short moment of time between those moments. So you make a decision or you take an action and you see the result of your action. And that is where you can learn a lot by experiencing. And at some point, your intuition, between quotes, kicks in because it has learned so much from your experience that it can kind of like project or guess what the result will be after I've taken this action. But he says if you don't have a lot of experience and then you use intuition, it's a dangerous field because you have no idea what's going on, especially when you have something like, and he gives the example a lot, I think, in his books. For example, if you have like an interview with a prospect for like a job, then the manager says, "Well, my intuition says this person is not good or not is really perfect for this job." And then there's a lot of time between the moment this person is hired and you see the actual effect, and this person really flourished in the organization, or this person really left in a certain amount of time, like within a year or so. And when you do this, he says it's very difficult to use your intuition because you don't have a lot of experience. I think that's one way of looking at it,
Mm-hmm.
an interesting way of looking at it. And I think the other way, what you also can do, of course, I think that's something that you also are looking to, is you can say, I have lived experience from the ancestors, from the people before me. So I'm using the history of my culture to make decisions, right? Like the lady that was the
Mm-hmm.
indigenous lady was saying, I'm reading the land or the environment to determine what my next step will be. Will I make this trip, yes or no? Which is very unusual for people who live in the West that we think like that, because then there's no way that's a logical thinking on this topic. But what you do then is you use your past, your generational history on making a decision.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not sure if I would call that intuition. Maybe you can, but definitely not a logical way of making decisions. You're using your history, your past, to making decisions which you didn't know you had in you.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not sure how you would experience that, but I think I like the explanation of Dan Ariely. If you trust on decision making on your intuition, I think you can do that if you have a lot of experience in this field, and if it's a very clear relationship between an action and the result. If that's not true, if there's a longer time, there are so many other issues or things that could happen why this thing didn't work out as you guessed or
Mm-hmm.
planned. It has probably nothing to do with the moment that you interview them. And the trap that we have is when we use intuition, for example, in these interviews, is that we like the people that look like us, that feel comfortable because they look like us. And that means, the trap means that we don't hire people who think differently and would really enrich the environment.
Mm-hmm.
And I think
Mm-hmm.
that's a I'm very I
Mm-hmm.
think this is a very interesting topic, like intuition.
Mm-hmm.
I think intuition could be a trap where you don't see new ways, where you don't see critical voices, where you don't hear critical voices, you don't bring critical voices into your environment, because if you do, it will enrich all of us, right? If we do that. But it doesn't feel comfortable, and thus the intuition wouldn't say that.
To be honest, I agree with you, and I've read that in some of. There was a time in my life when I was reading a lot about psychology, psychoanalytics, and all of that. But it brings me two different points where it kind of raises the exceptional cases where it may not fit within this idea. But mostly, I agree with a lot of the experiences. Some scholars, again, psychology calls it either subconscious or our unconscious mind, and that is basically built from the repetition of the habits we have throughout our life. Perhaps some people call it intuition. But then it brings me two different scholars. One is Carl Jung, and Carl Jung, obviously, I don't know if you've heard about him, and he was looking a lot about dreams and also how our thoughts are being constructed. Partially, yes, it's habits, it's experiences we have, it's lived experiences, and that's undeniable. And that other small more component of this thinking, he was saying there has to be something beyond ourselves that is putting that into our minds. Because if it's the same thing, like even people who saw the same exact dream, he was interpreting dreams, he was like exactly the same thing, but it would mean completely different things for different people. But that again could be connected with their lived experience. But then obviously he kind of dig down deeper and he said, how our thoughts are being formulated. Are we the ones who have full control over our thoughts and power over how we think? Or if there's anything beyond us which somehow puts those thoughts into our mind. And obviously, he was more inclined towards that kind of maybe something beyond us. And this brings me also to a lot of cultures and the idea of God and religions, faiths, and stuff. So that's one thing. Another thing is one of the work done by I'm I think it's the search for meaning.
Viktor Frankl.
Victor, yes, and he says, well, again, this is a kind of something which I remember. He says, if you put in individuals in the same kind of environment and you kind of do a long term study about them, the reactions definitely is going to be different from everybody, regardless of the experiences they have. And he also, obviously, one of the things he said was rising above, like, of course, the concentration camps and the amount of kind of difficulty. And obviously, it's even difficult to put it in words. Everybody gone through, but they were individuals who rise above and they still showed that level of selflessness. And everybody can be selfish. So that was another thing which always makes me think, like as much as I'm inclined towards lived experiences, habits, environment, how about these? Because in these situations, even if every individual lives the same experience, it's still going to be different for different people and they're going to react differently. So what makes that different then? So these are the things, and it kind of brings me back to the idea of intuition. It could vary for people partially, it could be constructed because of our lived experiences. But then I've also seen people with very strong intuitive kind of capabilities. And I'd be like, how this is coming from? And is it Jung which says that actually there might be something beyond us, which puts that into people? And it's also the idea of nature versus nurture,
Hmm.
environment versus like our innate kind of traits that we are born with. And where's that coming from? So yeah, these are very interesting conversations and a lot of questions around that, which I also always ask myself. And I think it goes back to your point of acquiring wisdom. So perhaps we are on a journey to keep asking and keep learning and relearning.
I think that's an interesting topic that I mentioned, that I talked about in my previous episode, 2 episodes ago. I was having, because we're talking about bringing new things to our minds, and I think if we looking into the mirror, which you mentioned before, and looking at ourselves and see how we are doing, what is our role, what's our history in this, the difficulty there is that you're asking yourself questions, which is interesting. Like Socrates is saying, right? You should ask yourself questions and learn from those questions and improve your questions. But it's better when somebody else is asking, or you asking somebody else the questions. Because I think if you do that, you will be confronted with a lot more different thinking on what's
Mm-hmm.
going on in your brain, right? Your brain has like a certain amount of expertise or experiences or knowledge, and but then you talk to somebody like you, and you get new ideas and new knowledge because you have a different perspective on the same case or situation. So I had this conversation with this lady, and she started a union for working animals. So the whole concept of starting a union for working animals is, of course, a very interesting concept, right? So first of all, I think most people understand what a union does, how a
Mm-hmm.
union works, and what a union can do. So it's a great wording that we use, that she uses, that gives us familiarity that we can think, oh yeah, I understand a union. So it makes it a lot easier. But then a union for working animals, that's weird because a union for humans,
Mm-hmm.
I know that, but for working animals, that's weird. So then you start listening. So why a union? And then she has these great points why a union for working animals is important and why it's important that somebody's on the board or in the seat speaking up for those animals because they can't speak up for themselves. And I think this is the same with when you look at about like decolonizing our educations or our politics or the inner development goals, whatever it is that we are trying to look at. So, what is our colonized history on this?
Mm-hmm.
I think what is important is that you have conversations with like a number of various different views on this topic so you understand and learn from other people what is their perspective on the same thing that I'm looking at from my culture or my background, right? So it's we have so many different views on the same topic, and if you do that with various people, like for example, if you go to an event that you've been to in Istanbul, you get so many different views from various cultures that you'll learn so much more on the topic than if you were on in Wales in school and doing a book research on the same topic.
I absolutely agree with that, absolutely. But one thing which I would like to also kind of bring to the conversation from my own experience, in order to actually engage in that authentic conversation and interaction with people where you learn, we have to put our ego aside, and also we have to be extremely open-minded and not take things personal and feel kind of attacked, because I've had experience with a lot of people and that's happening. One example from my teaching, and I keep telling my students, think about your intention behind asking a question. Are you asking the question to make the other side feel they don't know enough, or are you asking the question out of curiosity because you want to know more yourself? That is one thing. And another thing is Hofstad is working a lot, and he's a scholar, he's a Dutch scholar, you might have heard his name. And he's talking about this concept of cultural islands. He says, in order to actually and authentically learn from people, you have to make sure you're leaving all your preconceived notions, everything else on the side. You go to this island with an open mind, open, completely open. And you shouldn't, because once you get into that moment, you become like a magnet. You want to attract, kind of really absorb different types of information, and that is where the actual change happens in perspectives. But getting into that moment in your life where you don't have any of these preconceived notions, it is going to take time, but it has to start from somewhere. And I so much agree with you. I also been in those really beautiful places with beautiful minded people who actually is really genuinely wanting to learn and want to teach you something. And the intention is not to teach you, but they're just being themselves. They tell you something, and it's so kind of, for me, I'm like, oh my god, I never thought about this like this before. So things like that, even with the first session in a development, one of the colleagues which I've met there, kind of individuals, he had really nice kind of ideas which made me think a lot about it, even about enlightenment, post enlightenment, decolonization, and all of that. And I agree, yes, we do need to ask questions and engage with other people. But at the same time, we need to work on ourselves also to have that open-mindedness to actually allow that space to kind of that space to transpire in a very genuine and authentic way where we actually learn and unlearn.
I've really enjoyed this conversation. I want to come to a close, but not before I'm giving you the space to talk about one more thing. As I saw on your LinkedIn post, you are working on, starting on, or having the idea for a book.
Yes.
What is it about? Why are you writing a book? Is it going to be like a really academic book, or what is it? What is it going to be?
So this is something which is going to be, it's a long-term project because I've got so many other things coming up at the moment. It might take me a few years to actually get to that place. But one of the things for me is this book is also personal in a way. So I'm in that place where I'm working on a lot of the kind of, again, the terminology frameworks and how I can decolonize them in a way. So currently I'm working in different pieces, but for that book, I want to look particularly on the idea of resistance and how resistance can be seen from a day-to-day, everyday lived experience of people and what we might call as an outsider as a resistance. Perhaps people on the ground may not call it resistance, but it could be a form of resistance. And this is driven again from my experience of kind of observing people on like in Afghanistan when I go there and I travel and I see around because there's a lot of books, every scholarship on Afghanistan about state building, and it kind of brought me in that moment. So if you see a vendor spend like kind of selling vegetables, all they care about is to get that vegetable sold by the end of the day so that they can go back to their family. And some of them are very young individuals. What happens, how many times regime changes in Afghanistan, state kind of elections, everything else from a very kind of state building project view doesn't matter to them. At the end of the day, all they care about is their survival, their day-to-day life. So what I really want to see is how I can bring in different projects together which reflects their reality, something which can lead to some sort of progress for them. And perhaps that in itself of being completely like careless and like not care about anything about what's happening like in terms of like politics and stuff, that in itself could be a form of resistance. But the scholarship hasn't kind of got down deeper in that sense of like what type. I am looking into Scott James' idea of everyday resistance and small things that he calls resistance, or also Bayot's work in everyday encroachment of life and stuff. But still, there's so much work to be done. And also, I'm reflecting on the way I look at things and analyze things, and how I can bring that sense of authenticity in my work. And that's something which I've been considering for a book project. I've had conversations with people about whether they want to work with me. One of the things which I don't want to do it, I don't want this to be kind of a form of like, oh, I'm doing this because I want to have promotions in my academic life and stuff. I just want it to be a very genuine project, which I even don't care about the like impact next day. If it is driven, I don't know what is going to happen with that, but I just want it to be very genuine, which reflects different forms of realities.
I really enjoyed this conversation and learning about, all these pockets that you brought in, all these tiny things that you brought in. On instead of just talking about one great topic, we had all these various nuggets that we talked about and bringing them together to, in my opinion, to bring back the larger piece of colonization by not just looking at huge topic of colonization, but just look at all these various things like being critical to yourself, putting your ego aside, these culture islands, or the idea of, asking questions, learning from other people and seeing how they are, looking for similarities, as you mentioned before. There's so many things that you mentioned that in total, I think, looking at the language that we all use on the same topic, in total is everything that we can learn about how to improve the decolonization process. And without, in the future, probably not using the word colonization anymore. because it's so much more than that.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I am in pursuit of finding something else, perhaps, or maybe nothing. Just feelings, a world where it's like, yeah, we don't use too many words. I don't know.
I know. Zulfia, thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Dat was het mooie gesprek met Zulfia. Je vindt de namen en links die we noemden in het artikel dat bij deze aflevering hoort. Ga daarvoor naar de site forimpact.com/show 482. Wil je vanzelf automatisch de volgende aflevering van deze podcast op je telefoon ontvangen? Dat kan heel eenvoudig. Heb je een iPhone, dan zit daar standaard de Apple Podcast app op. Open deze app en zoek dan naar de Decide for Impact podcast en klik op abonneer. Heb je een Android-telefoon, installeer dan eerst bijvoorbeeld de Player FM app. Open dan de app, zoek daar naar de Decide for Impact podcast en klik op abonneer. Dankjewel hiervoor. Heb je een vraag, opmerking of reactie op deze aflevering met Zulfia of op de podcast in het algemeen? Stuur dan een e-mail naar podcast@decideforimpact.com. Dan weet ik dat het over de podcast gaat. Ik hoor super graag van jou. Wil je leren hoe je energie vindt en focus met jouw innerlijke kompas? Hoe verbinding in je team het verschil maakt? Hoe je vertrouwen krijgt in je collega's en hoe je een moedig mens wordt? Download dan het boek Impact Besluiten waarmee je nieuwe medewerkers aantrekt op de site forimpact.com. Dit is mijn nieuwste boek en je downloadt het daarom helemaal gratis. Je hebt zelfs geen e-mailadres nodig. Vraag jouw boek nu aan op decideforimpact.com. En ik weet, je hebt een volle agenda, je leest het in 1 avond tijd. Dankjewel voor het luisteren en graag tot de volgende.